Big subject. Big subject.
Greetings, everybody. Welcome aboard.
Hello, hello.
I know somebody just emailed us. Who was that? Anyway, I think a lot of people are wishing us well, even if they don't show up today. So I think, oh, it's Marco. Marco sent us an email, said he wasn't going to be here, but he was really looking forward to watching this. I wanted to start out, I sort of want to weave in some of the discussion that we've already had about this book, and then maybe we can go a little bit deeper into our motivations and where we would like to start, because it's such an ambitious undertaking. And I had a little bit, I had a hard time sleeping last night because a lot of this is just spinning in my head. And a lot of things were coming to me that I want to develop further. But I just wanted to, like I said, re-enter the weave of our discussion that we've already been having. And I'm just going to quote from that discussion. I initially quoted Karen Barad. She's a physicist. And she said, when we gaze up into the night sky, we see spatial configuration of stars we call constellations. The stars are not all the same distance from us. Some stars are further away than others. And since the speed of light is constant, when we look at it, more distant objects, we are looking deeper into the past. For example, when we look at the sun, we are looking at the way it looked 8 minutes ago. That is, we are watching in the present something that happened in the past. Staring at a constellation, we are witnessing multiple different pasts in the present, some more different than others. Constellations are then images of a specific array of past events, a configuration of multiple temporalities, a constellation in being. And I thought it was interesting, TJ's quote. This is one of the best illustrations of sense-making of the past, of which history is one way, and which is necessarily done in the present, that I think I've ever heard. Facts as stars, but history as constellation, itself in space-time motion, forming a picture only when the wave function collapses into a moment viewed from a moment. And I just want to add something that Ed said. When we're discussing big ticket items like religion, culture, consciousness, we can throw in language, and given the general tenor of our current mullings, evolution too. So I would say, instead of mullings, Ed says mullings, I say musings. That I think that's a difference in vocabulary. They're pretty much the same word. So with all of that.
Do they have the same root?
I wouldn't know. Maybe Ed would. I wouldn't.
Yeah,
I wouldn't be.
So. Not mulling.
I don't think they do.
Yeah.
So with all of that, where would you like to start? Who wants to go first? TJ? Ed?
Do we want to go by the outline we set, or you want to just launch into?
Start wherever you want.
Space, yeah.
However way you want to.
What had struck me most about the I already forget the author that you just quoted, but about the constellations and the stars. And what had struck me is human nature is such an abused term, but if you were going to look at whatever we kind of identify as a constant there, as the speed of light is the constant in the cosmos, then when we're looking at a particular constellation or a particular social and cultural configuration, we're looking at it from a point of view, from a moment, and we're looking at it from a present moment. And that's the way it's going to look from where we are, given whatever experiences that we've accumulated when we're looking at it. But that's not going to be the way it's going to stay, even though, if we're going to use the analogy for the Earth, we're only here for a short time. The star patterns haven't changed, and certainly in the million years that we've been on the planet, but they are changing. Stars are moving. The Big Dipper's not going to look the way, in however many millions of years from now, it's not going to look the way it does today. And that's what struck me as most interesting. History on a smaller scale is all about that shifting perceptions and changing.
And I like what you said about facts as stars, but history is
they're set, but the way that they're in relationship to each other, that's not as set.
And I have a big question, which I can ask later if I develop it a little bit, about facts and what the difference between what the Timothy Morton, the philosopher, calls the difference between a fact and a factoid. But we can go into that later. It's a little complicated. But what about you, Ed? Where would you like to start? Thank you, TJ.
As always, John, I'd like to start at the beginning, wherever the hell that is.
Well, I'm always in the middle. I'm never at a beginning.
And that's it. You know, where is that? I think one of the things that I would like, or I would like to for us to do, because we are talking about a lot of words that are used in a lot of ways, is that we kind of hone in a little bit so that we all kind of get on the same lambda, that, you know, that when we're using a term, however, whether in some special way or some general way, that we kind of know what that means to us, or what it means to the person that's speaking. Because I think a lot of times we talk past each other simply because I assume that when you use a word in any musings, that musings may be one thing. To me, I chose Mullings because to me, Mullings is a little more dampened. It's not, you say, yeah, because it's just like, okay, well, I'm kind of mulling this over. I'm trying to make a decision. I'm trying to do something. I make those kind of associations. Whereas musing, I like musings, but for me, musings is always lighter, even though obviously if you read a lot of poets, they're anything but, you know, but we have these connotations that are kind of like built into our own use of language. And if we can sort out some of those nuances so that we know what we're kind of aiming at when we say words, that would be very helpful. And that's one of the things it seemed to me that from the agenda we would be looking at today. But that's my take there.
That sounds good to me. So I was thinking, this is a little exercise I give myself. For this seminar to be useful for me, this seminar will be like a prayer. And for this seminar to be like a prayer, I will be a servant of truth. And that's a really weird word for me, to tell you the truth, to use, because I don't use truth except in the way I just did. Because truth is one of those big ticket items I tend to avoid. I'm much more into the factoidal and the truthiness, you know, as we move into this post-truth age rather rapidly. So that's where I'm coming from, a kind of, I sort of want to, when we're talking about God, this is a very big ticket item. And I have I think I naturally go towards the metaphorical. And you mentioned poetry, the poet. And I find myself drawn to this particular poet. It's a very short poem. I think it's sort of, there's a relationship between this short poem and the Angel of History, that Paul Klee drawing, that's our mascot. Thou art indeed just, Lord, if I contend with thee. But sir, so what I plead is just. Why do sinners' ways prosper? And why does disappointment all I endeavor end? Wert thou my enemy, O thou my friend, how wouldst thou worse, I wonder, than thou dost defeat thwart me? Oh, the sots and thralls of lust do in spare hours more thrive than I, sir, that spend life upon thy cause. See, banks and breaks now leave it how thick, laced they are again with Freddie Sherville. Look, and fresh wind shakes them. Birds build, but not I build, no, but strain, time's eunuch, and not breed, one work that wakes. Mine, O thou Lord of life, send my roots rain. And I find that a very poignant poem by this amazing poet. Even though the language is a little archaic, I think we can recognize that there's a modern mind working here. A modern mind that's very mixed up with the mythical and the magical as well. So these are the kind of challenges I think we're all facing as we read this huge book with many different thinkers coming from many different levels and different traditions and different disciplines. So I'm throwing that out there and would invite either one of you, if you want to participate in that way, because it is a musing metaphor. If this seminar to be really useful for you, this seminar will be like what? If that's a question that moves you in any way or gives you a sense of direction or something to handle on this, I would be very curious. However, if that doesn't work for you, that's fine too. You can go, like I said, whatever best for you. Thanks.
I've chosen a metaphor of if this for the seminar to be useful for me, it would be a path with light shining on it, and I'm shining light as I'm walking, but I would appreciate, or if for the lights that are coming from other directions are shining, or also helping illuminate this path. Lights from directions I wouldn't even have considered, or be any kind of expert. I'm not even an expert in the path I'm on, but just kind of that extra illumination coming in from different ways. And as a servant of understanding, I'll put it that way, because yeah, truth is another one of those big ticket words. I totally agree with that.
A servant of understanding. Is there anything else? Yeah.
No, not right now.
Thank you. And a path of light and shining light and lights coming from different directions.
Right.
And a servant of understanding. Thanks. And Ed, what about you?
I thought about that this afternoon as well. In the metaphor that came to my mind was that for the seminar to be useful, it would be like tuning a radio. Kind of like sitting around, and we used to do this at my grandmother's house. She had an old radio that had also a long, what do you call that? You could listen to foreign countries. You could not shortwave, but she also had long wave. It was one of those you could set the different dials. But we used to sit around it and try to hone in on a channel. And my sister would say, "Oh, you have to go back a little. You have to go forward a little bit." And so there was always this constant interaction on trying to reduce the static of what was coming across. And that static reduction and getting a little more clear. I think the clarity fits in well with, on the one hand, what TJ was saying about light on the path. That brings clarity. I also think it fits in well with your prayer metaphor, John, because that's also a way to look for clarity. So clarity and understanding has always been a kind of a buzzword with me for a long time. So I can get on board with that very easily. But that was my metaphor was the radio tuning.
Great. Tuning a radio. Oh, sure, Michael. Sorry.
Just because I think I'm going to be doing more observing, but I want you guys to understand my metaphor is Chaucer's tales on a pilgrimage. I'm on a pilgrimage going somewhere, something that I've been told that's larger than myself. And from time to time, around the campfire, I want to listen to everybody's experience through story.
Great.
So there's fire, there's tuning in, and there's prayer, from my point of view.
fire tuning in and prayer and reducing the static,
Yeah.
and light illuminating from different directions, and a servant of understanding, and a servant of truth, and Chaucer's Tale, and a pilgrimage. So with all of that, this is once again, a sort of big question. Is there a relationship between all of this and a second order culture?
I think a second order culture, if I'm understanding Dave Orr and I'm understanding, actually, John, you were espousing this quite a bit also, is that just those things, I think, that, and we don't do it enough, I guess, is the real problem, in our day today, is that stepping back and reflecting, where are we? Where are we going? Is this the path to where we want to go? Are we sure? Those kinds of things. And that's it. It's going to be a debate. It's not a culture. One of my favorite quotes from Ian Morris, who wrote Why the West Rules for Now, is that culture, people tend to argue about culture and tend to describe culture these days as if it is a thing, a monolithic thing that determines what we say, what we do, what we eat, how we dress. And Ian Morris pointed out, and I forget the exact words, but culture is more like a town meeting. Culture is more like options being debated, and that whole sense that we have choices here to make, and we have different things that are going to benefit different people, and we're going to have to kind of pull that together as a society. And that's that process that's the culture, not this thing that people are already up in arms about. And I think second order culture is just a way of making that transparent. I was hoping not to be the first one to bring him into the discussion, but yeah, making it transparent.
Who is that?
You know who. Transparency, diaphany.
Mr. Gebser. Okay.
Wasn't me. Yeah, it wasn't me.
I was hoping not.
I really like culture is a town meeting. I really like that.
Yeah.
So it's a culture, it's a town meeting made a little more transparent.
Right.
Very cool. Does someone have something different? Michael or Ed?
Yeah, and this stepping back, though, I think one of the things that's not brought in stepping back is down-regulating or the fear, because a lot of this is moving to that second order has to be honoring. Part of the reason, if we want to step back, is to stop getting overwhelmed by the fear of the whatever experience we're having in the moment that brought us to the town meeting. Something has moved us to the town meeting, and until this is just me personally, until we kind of just do whatever practices to stepping back, not giving up on that, because that could be looked at as a motivator. Fear can be a motivator if we know how to work with it and use stepping back to, well, what is it telling us? I think that's one thing that could be added as a supplement. I'm not saying the only thing, but I think it's one thing that I experienced in myself and I experienced in the world of people not knowing how to do that. They're just driven habitually to not step back and consider second order, if you want to use that language, so that they can find a better way through what they experience as chaos.
Yes. Thank you, Michael. And I'm really glad that we finished up the Bateson yesterday.
Yeah.
And we talked a lot about second order culture in the base and those calls. So I think this is sort of a cross fertilization that may be happening between that group and this group. So do you have something, Ed, to add to that?
I don't know if it's an adding or not. Culture is something I think about a lot because I live in one that's very different than the one I grew up in. but I'm not always sure about neither the one I grew up in or the one that I'm living in now. I was recently having a little talk with the lady that was cutting my hair, and I live right in the middle of Germany, right in the practically at the geographical center. And the state that I live in is Hessen. It's a small Bundesland state, if you will. It's about the size of Israel, has about the same population, about 5 million people. So it's not very large. But the difference there's a rivalry between people from the northern part of Hessen, which is sometimes called North Hessen, sometimes called East Hessen, sometimes called Upper Hessen. It has a lot of different names than the people in the south of Hessen, who are down around Frankfurt and Wiesbaden, where the capital is. And although they share things are very different. You know, the people there's always this north-south divide. You know, you come from the south, John, you live in the north now. There's this huge divide in the States. Well, in Europe, because we have a lot more dialects, and this is perhaps a language-related thing, these differences get accentuated over very short distances. So it's possible here. My mother-in-law spoke a dialect I just was beginning to understand before we moved away. I couldn't speak it, but when the neighbors were talking over the fence, I could kind of follow along. And then I got the job teaching at the boarding school, which was 3 kilometers away, or about 2 miles. And I couldn't understand the people there when they spoke dialect. It sounded similar, but it was different. It was completely different. So how they sliced up the world linguistically was different. And in my travels, especially when I was in the Army, I was able to get around a little bit. And thereafter, when you show up somewhere, everybody recognizes immediately, well, you're not from here. And they can, my biggest challenge is not being recognized as an American when I'm speaking, because I don't speak German like an American. A lot of people say you could be Dutch, which I take as a compliment. Dutch people think it's an insult, you know, so that you're doing that. But wherever you are, there are certain things that the people eat there. I'll just give you an example because it grosses some folks out. Here in Hessen, it's very common to eat noodles with applesauce on them. And that could be a whole meal. So lunch could be noodles with applesauce instead of spaghetti sauce. You put applesauce on. Well, my daughter and son-in-law with the kids were with friends, and they went traveling. They were over in Thüringen, which is probably about 50 kilometers, maybe 100 kilometers east of here. And they were in a restaurant. And my grandson's a very picky eater to begin with. And so they were looking, they have noodles on the menu, and they did, because she was just going to get him some buttered noodles because he generally eats noodles. And then she saw that they had applesauce listed as like a dessert or a side dish. And she said to the woman, "Can I have the applesauce with the noodles? Just put it on." And the lady just stopped dead and looked at her and said, "Why would you do that?" and my daughter said, "Well, because that's what my son likes." And immediately the friend said, "Oh, can I have that for my son too?" So this woman was going through, we'll call it in a small scale, cultural shock. Yeah, simply being eaten for lunch. And this is over 100 kilometers. And so the question that comes up to my mind, well, what the hell is culture? None of us question any of it. And we all act, I find the town meeting metaphor real nice, except I don't know who's like attending or paying attention, or who's voting, because, this just kind of happens and we all act and react accordingly. And I know that a lot of times when I get into troubles, an overstatement, but when I get into situations that cause a conversation to stop or things snag a little, you realize it's because I've simply operated on some unspoken, unreflected, unrecognized, not even conceived of assumption of how the world works and it has something to do with where I was brought up and where I was born and all the things that have happened in the meantime. One of the biggest complaints, if I can put it that way, when I was working in California, I had if you think I'm a curmudgeon, you should have known Jake, but I worked with this guy as a tech writer, and one of his favorite phrases when we were talking or have a discussion, he would often say to me, "You can tell you're not from here." Now, he was originally from Iowa, so I always had to ask him, well, where's here for you at this moment? You know, because he lived in California for a long time, and he was an old Navy guy. And I had grown up in Pennsylvania, but he meant you're foreign. What you're doing, what you are bringing into this conversation was from my experience in Germany when I was there. I was bringing in, let's call it thought patterns or argumentation patterns that were completely strange to him. He says, and it wasn't offensive in that regard. It was simply, it takes some getting used to, Ed, because you're going to say things that are going to, really throw us off balance, just how you go about doing it, because you have that. And so, I often wonder just what is, because we all talk about it. And so second order culture is stopping and thinking and reflecting and stepping back and trying, what I've been doing all along, trying to figure out where am I and what's the best next move at all, then, I'm all for it. But the concept itself as a little phrase wasn't registering well with me. I was trying to figure out, what did that actually mean? So this has been very helpful in clarifying that. But it's, and we talk about them across a huge scale, from the individual to, I don't know, all the way up to cultures. We talk about the
transcultural. Yeah.
So like the Mesopotamians or something, like, and they were obviously, I'm going to guess, just a wild one, they were not monolithic either. They might have been more in tune with one another, but I'm guessing that there was a whole lot of variety going on that the people on the west side didn't particularly like from the people on the east side. And you get that everywhere you go, because like I said, in Hessen, you can drive from the northern tip to the southern part in 3 hours. It's not like it's a big ride somewhere. You're not traveling a great distance, but you are going through a whole lot of different thing. Up here, people, when they talk, they schwätz, which is kind of like they just jabber, we might say. But the people down in around Frankfurt, they babble. So, well, at least that's what we say up here. I don't know what they call it down there. I think when they're down there, they say we're talking. Yeah.
Well, wouldn't it be, and Ed, you probably know this, the root meaning of culture, because always when I hear the word culture, I'm sorry, but I think of a petri dish. and that's what I'm thinking of when you're talking about, here's one petri dish, here's another.
Yeah.
And I'm trying
that is one of the roots of the word.
Yeah, I know. And it makes me, I can't quote where this came from, I can't quote, but it just made sense that as much as there may be, culture in the general sense, it's this notion of the one and the many, that we're each a culture unto ourselves in a way. And that's where the step back, or the second order, that I think, Ed, like you've been practicing, is knowing that your culture isn't the same no matter where you go. The culture in our own brain, that yogurt culture that our brain is like,
So you can, the unspoken assumptions, and we find out about our culture, it's usually nonverbal, but when we've made a mistake, you may say something, all of a sudden the room gets quiet. Then you realize, okay, I violated some rule. I don't know what that rule is, but I'm getting a nonverbal message that's loud and clear.
Very hostile sometimes.
Yeah. And I knew this from moving from the south to the north, because this is a very poignant story for me. I came to the north and I found a circle of friends in the East Village, and we were all outlaws, basically, refugees from the suburbs. And we were having a lot of fun. And I had a friend that I knew in college. She came up to visit me. from down south. And we were all in a room. We were all in my living room, and we were all talking, a handful of us. And we all thought we were really hip and sophisticated. But this friend from the South, she proceeded to tell a racist joke, which was extremely common behavior in the South. But I could tell the look on her face when she didn't get a laugh, but got stony silence from everybody. I think she knew, like, right away, oh, I'm in a different place. I've never been to
Kansas anymore, Toto.
Exactly. And I didn't know how to explain this to her, you know? But she knew she'd made a big mistake. And even in some circles within the South, that would have been a very bad choice. But once again, and I'm sure this happened maybe 35 years ago. I think things have changed quite a bit. But that's why I'm curious about facts and factoids. A fact that has been arrived at through certain kind of experiments, like a scientific fact. And then there are the social facts that we're all familiar with, like cultural mistakes or faux pas, or you walk into the ladies' room rather than the men's room and you go, oh, I'm in the wrong place. You know, those kind of violations we've all had, embarrassing moments we've all had. And then there are the factoids, and I'm borrowing here from this philosopher, Timothy Morton. He writes on ecology. He said factoids are like truth, but they're sort of dressed up to act as, to be like truth, or they have a truthiness to them. And he says we're surrounded by factoids, and that have not been arrived at through any kind of peer-reviewed process. And yet they're dressed up to look, and they're quoted as if they have the power of a fact. And I found that very stimulating, especially, so as I read now, and I started reading Merlin Donald again, he says, this is a fact, this is a fact, this is a fact. And I'm like, oh, okay. He's letting me know what he considers a fact to be. And so I find that part of my own, like, thinking about this stuff and what the difference could be between a first order culture where the facts are just given and everyone assumes they're true, like, and then there's a second order culture. And I think this anecdote I just shared about my friend from the South, I think she woke up real fast that she's moving from a first order to a second order culture. There were already people who were, like in my circle in New York, that were assuming different kinds of things than were assumed in the social circle I was in when I was with her in college in the Deep South. So those are some of my reflections on how do we know when we're moving from a first order to a second order culture. And I think in our conversations in Bateson, there's a lot of discussion about this, because I think Bateson was a first order. He was in a early AI, early cybernetic theory, and he was questioning the tendency to objectify others. And that seems to be a very first order kind of setup. When I'm the subject, you're the object, I enter into your system, I can intervene in it as an observer, and I can do whatever I want to that culture and extract value from it. And I think he was challenging that kind of systems theory. And he was, I think, writing a second order kind of cultural dynamic. And he was wondering how we could get even to a third order. And I think there are signs that I believe there are people who are thinking, coming out of already a third order. And I believe there may be a relationship between that and what our friend Gebser was talking about when he was talking about the integral, or sometimes he called it the aperspectival. But that and I loved his idea that we have all those structures from archaic, magical, mythical, rational, and the blending of all of those, the healthy forms of those previous structures happen in the integral. But that he was sort of, I think through his analysis, he thought we were in these cul-de-sacs promoted by the unhealthy mental structure. which tended to and be antagonistic to all those previous structures. And to connect that to what our reading in this book that we're studying together, I think the first authors have sort of started to flesh this out. But I think definitely in Bellah's book, he spends a great deal of time on this, even though he never mentions Gebser. So I think this is something that we are maybe in a unique position to sort of add that into the mix, since we are students of Gebser, and it seems to be that we're the only ones who are working with Gebser, because I think he should be in this mix of theorists. Anyway, I'm really open to hear what you guys are taking from this.
Having just reread, I was gonna do sections of it, but I ended up rereading the whole thing, and I love that book, Ever Present. Really,
yeah, it's awesome.
To kind of piggyback on what you were saying, John, he's attacking dualisms.
Mm-hmm.
His main bugbear, and I completely agree with them, you know, is all the dichotomies that we set up, like the free will versus determinism debate. Neither extreme exists in real life, but we set this up as a dichotomy. It's nature or it's nurture, it's left or and all these things. He attacks that. If we take what is good in each structure, we're not going to try to go into deficient quantifying modes where we're trying to control things from each one. And magical does it, mythical does it, as well as mental. And so for him, and what I brought up in the preparatory thread for this is, the first time I went through it, I'm going through his charts and I'm looking at it. I'm going row by row and looking at the salient parts of each structure, and I'm appreciating that. But this time I went back and it's like, well, wait a minute. Each structure contains everything that went above it. So that means I'm trying to force integral into this kind of weird ethereal thing. It's like, no, it's just appreciating how everything kind of fits together. And when you step out of dualism and when you bring time back into it, when you're talking about facts, you have an added dimension to look at facts. Fact, a star blows up. We see the star because it blew up 600,000 light years away. So we're never going to see the star blow up and disappear. What's the fact? Our vision right here is that the star is still there. The fact is the star blew up. It's both, even though we only have the perspective on one.
Yeah, that's intense. Were you going to say something, Ed? Is something coming to you?
Yeah, well, it was. I'm going to jump back just a little bit to Michael's original question. One of the root that's in culture is cult.
Oh.
So a cult is a very, and here DJ's mentioning of Gebser, if we look at the mythical structure of consciousness, how all of this gets organized into, we would call it a system today, from our, let's say, from the mental rational structure, but I don't think the Egyptians saw what they were doing as a system. Right. Even though that's what it does. It all hung together. It was all very meaningful. It was all interrelated. Each part shed meaning on the other aspects that were in there. And it provided a basis for how they dealt with their time and space. Okay. Because, and this is one of the things I know that we will get into, and I've been trying to go through Gebser again and just glean whatever he has to say about religion, because that's one of our big ticket things. And I think he has a real helpful way of looking at this, because he breaks it down. And this is, to me, one of the places that would have been very helpful for Bellah and Joas and a lot of the authors of the book, because it would allow them to have I'm going to say it a little, it's going to sound more arrogant than I mean it, a more differentiated look at what it is that they're looking at. The categories that they're trying to apply, it's not a problem, but it's one of the issues I have with Donald, is it's very nice, and I really appreciate what he's trying to do, but it's too coarse-grained. And it needs, I think it would do well to have a little more fine-tuning it. I don't think we have to get down into every nitty little detail. That would be self-defeating in the end. That would be very, very mental rational, so to speak. But in order to see it in a more differentiated manner and and to speak of it in terms that are appropriate to that manner of looking at it can be very helpful. So when we're looking at the cult, when we talk about cults today, it's just automatically bad. Well, no, it's just a way of looking at things. Okay, I can step back and take a look at it. I know that some of them have very evil things that can come out of that, but on the whole, what people were doing for most of our existence as a species was trying to make sense of the world, and that was one way to do it, and it was a very effective way to do it. So we need to, if we can appreciate that and bring that along with what we're coming up to, and what we're looking at now, then that's very helpful. It ties in also with what John was saying about facts and factoids. Facts are very strange things. It becomes especially apparent in these days where you can have alternative facts. Which is, it's just like, that was one of those things that sometimes something floats out of the TV. I'm not even watching it, it's on in the background, and this comes out, and it's just like gobsmacks me. And I'm going, what's that? Yeah, but it has a certain sense to it, even though it's not very helpful for me personally, but it does have a certain amount of sense, and it is helpful for me when I understand that other people are looking at it that way, because one of the goods, ills, whatever that came out of cybernetics and postmodern thinking and whatnot was constructivism. And, we kind of make things up as we go along, and we all get this idea that we're doing it individually, but we're probably not doing it individually, even though we all do something individually that's different from what everybody else does. But it's not, making it up in that sense. Because I have a book up here on my shelf that John reminded me of by a guy by the name of Fleck. It's called Die Entstehung der wissenschaftlichen Tatsache, which in English would be the emergence of the scientific, and the word can be translated as fact, but a Tatsache is a done thing. It literally, that's what the word means, done thing. That's a Tatsache. That's the way it is, whatever that is. Okay, so what you're looking for, the Germans use the word Fakt, and if they use it as a noun, it's a factum. It's still got the Latin ending on it. They're very traditional in a lot of regards. But they would talk more about Tatsachen, done things that are done, things that come up. But the word Sache in German is one of those words that you find everywhere. It just keeps showing up. They have a distinction that they make, and it does play into this, between what they call sachlich and fachlich. And sachlich in that sense means pertaining to the matter at hand. It's relevant for the matter, and it is sachlich. It's not, we would in a lot of cases say objective, but it's more than just objective. Because it's got a kind of a personal interaction to it. And fachlich means subject related. And a lot of people make their fachliche statements, their subject matter related statements, sound as if they are sachlich, as if they are thingly. You mentioned before, as if culture were a thing. It's not. It's probably more like a process. It's probably more like a sloppy process on top of that, if it's even a process at all. And it's amazing that anything ever comes out of it. That kind of, so we're starting to get into that. But there was a time not too long ago where we would have probably argued about some of those kinds of things, about whether it is and whether it isn't. So, and Fleck argues in his books that what is in the end a fact in science is simply a socially agreed upon whatever. It's not like it's something that just happens to be and it is unalterable and will never change. It's like your exploding star, TJ. You can look up and star's up there. I can see it. Well, no, you just see the light that's emanating from when it was in 600 million years. I'll meet you back here and you'll see it go or whatever it does up there. I don't know. But those are time frames that we just can't deal with. So obviously, what is that, the fact, or is it the factoid? I use a lot of if you watch any kind of a quiz show, factoids are, these are little things that you got to know. I always wanted, my kids won't play Trivial Pursuit with me anymore because I always, because I know too many things that aren't worth knowing, you know. And those are the things that get asked in Trivial Pursuit. And I said, well, that's in the name, Trivial Pursuit.
That's sort of what he said about factoids. Factoids, he says, is data that is usually very tiny.
Yeah, yes, it is. And it's hardly relevant. You have to like create context to make it relevant.
And you can elaborate. You can elaborate. And there, if you pile on the factoids, which are small bits of data that come from different levels in a system, you can easily start entering into a post-truth era.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And I think that's the challenge as we move from, well, I found a quote actually from Charles Taylor, Second Order Thinking, the second paragraph in his essay. He says, real simply, the introduction of Second Order Thinking is in which the formulae we use to describe or operate in the world themselves comes under critical examination. Okay. So I think just differentiating, as you have just done, the relevant to the matter at hand, what do you call it, and the difference between that and a thing, yes. The difference between that would be a kind of second order processing, as I think we've been doing here in this distinction between the fact and factoids, and how do we know the difference, especially when we're dealing with the physical, with the social worlds, which are so much more complex, it seems to me, in so many ways than, oh, if we have an empirical experiment, we can test this, and we have a peer review, and we have different ways of organizing, creating a procedure, then we can stamp this and certify it as a fact. But I think what we're dealing with in our social worlds is so much more subtle and nuanced than anything like that.
I was going to come right out from what you were saying with the difference between, okay, let's say we can do scientific experiments in the lab and we can make datum and little pieces of data and put them together. Then you come to history and you come to human beings and you come to the whole, well, I was going to get into this too, evolution as one of the terms that we were going to argue with and define. And that I'm always very careful to have concepts of biological evolution as opposed to cultural evolution in my head when I'm reading this. I may be wrong, but that's, I kind of make sure that's a big difference. And it's actually brought up later in the book. I think John Osman in one of the chapters points that out too. There's adaptation to the niche, and then there's shaping the niche and changing things around, which is what happens in culture all the time. Going back to, history. So again, facts and stars and little pieces of data, you may be able to put the evidence together for an event or for someone's diary entry or for some, and you have them, but then you have to interpret them. And this is a big question in all philosophy of history. You have to string them together. You have to attribute some kind of sense to the factoids or the fact that the data that you have. And that process, which kind of in the deficient rational is an invisible process. We don't pay attention to the fact that now we're interpreting things. Now we're ascribing meaning to things. Now we're trying to make sense out of things, which really are just, as what Toynbee would say, one damn thing after another if you don't put a framework around it, which he did. And he was very much against the whole kind of history. History is what you make of it, but that process is important. So for my way of thinking, that would be the first order of things. And that kind of, if you don't examine it, which is what second order does, then you start believing your own interpretations are set in stone. You start taking the data that was fact before, and then your interpretation of the data, which is still subjective, but then you start thinking that subjectivity or that even that intersubjectivity is objectivity. And then you're going to other cultures and you're doing whatever you want because your way of looking at it is correct.
That's very helpful. And I had a question, but I think I was going to pose to you because I know historiography is your passion. I think of you, Ed, as the hermeneutic guy, and I think of TJ as the history guy. I may be wrong.
I wish I could be the history guy. I'm not an expert.
and Michael, I think you're the body worker. You're the guy who's into the body.
Yeah, I have to take my lead from both the other two. And then I mold it to the way I can.
Yeah.
I definitely have to use my body to understand what TJ or
Yeah.
Andrew is saying.
Yeah, I'm sort of a perceptually oriented person too.
Yeah.
So I have to say,
But I do take TJ's point in that this whole, especially from the body, and this is based on Kearney, of that skill set of what we're doing with interpretation when we're interpreting. I personally believe that if we can keep,
Thank you for that article, by the way. That was really good.
yeah, if we can keep humble, like he says, in the act of interpreting, because we're going to do it.
right.
But if we can get humble and never frame it as an absolute, I think, and actually that's what human beings need to do better, is how are you bringing narrative to your experience on whatever level.
Right.
And
Right.
second order seems to me, just listening to this right now, second order is really trying to move the ball,
Right.
you know, out of the first order of trying to think in absolutes and think of relationality, not dualism. I think of my whole thought process is to think of what people may call duality as a relationality, because I take things so physically. I think because when you're in your physical body, you sense what's the relationship of yourself in space,
Right.
and with other people.
Right. And I
Thank
think
you.
I think Gebser has a lot to say about that, the mythic, the magical, and the mental structure, and the interplay between them, and how I think the mental structure cuts itself off
Yes.
from those previous structures, and that becomes extremely perilous for everybody.
That's deficient.
And I
was gonna say that's rational. I mean, we
Yeah.
tend to kind of
Okay.
take, but don't throw out the mental structure baby with the bathwater of the deficient structure.
Okay.
Rational. I mean, mental structure is definitely, you know.
But it's those who like to dance, singers,
Right.
dancers, actors, athletes, people who got to move and shake, you know, they're looked down upon. Whereas people who do mental theoretical work are highly privileged in our educational system. And I think that may be a broad generalization because we pay athletes lots of money, probably a lot more than we do scientists, but or entertainers, yeah, for sure.
To entertain us.
Yes. But I think that may be exaggerated, but I do think there is a little bit in the deficient mental of looking down on all those previous structures and over prizing the cognitive and the theoretical. And I think Merlin Donald points this out because I can't find the quote, but he was basically saying that the mythical structure, the magical and the mythical, are far more powerful than the mental.
Mm-hmm.
He said the mimetic, the ability to gesture and move, is so primary, and language, in his view, merges out of gesture, out of the gestural repertoire that people have been using from the very beginning to communicate. And we still do. We talk, but look at me, I'm moving my hands all over the place.
But so, John, we don't want to fall into the trap that we feel from being oppressed by the mental rational. We want to also stay open to the mental rational, right, TJ?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that's not. I actually have the quote, John. It's from page 72. And
could you read it? Do you have it? I was looking for it.
Because you had mentioned modern mind, but you mentioned modern mind is a mix, and that's exactly what Donald said. The quote: the modern mind is a complex mix of mimetic, mythic, and theoretic elements. Art, ritual, and music reflect the continuation of the mimetic dimension of culture in modern life. Narratives of the great religious books reflect the mythic dimension, as do secular myths of modern society. It's not just religion. These great domains, that's a big argument too, right? These two great domains, the mimetic and the mythic, are mandatory, hardwired, and extremely subtle and powerful ways of thinking.
Right.
They cannot be matched by analytic thought for intuitive speed, complexity, and shrewdness. They will continue to be crucially important in the future because they reside in innate capacities without which human beings could not function. And the only little criticism I would have is that they're not really ways of thinking, but he hasn't read Gebser probably, so we'll give him that point.
Thank you.
And the only stumbling block I had in that quote, I recall, because I also recall my flagging it, noting in the side, is he used the trigger word for me, which is hardwired. I haven't figured that one out yet, but it's one of those notes. You know, it's like hardwired, of course, okay, kind of thing.
Yeah, because Ed, I liked when you've said, yeah, we're hardwired, but we can be rewired.
Well, this is the thing. We can probably be a lot of things. This whole discussion about the physical and the cognitive, or let's say the intellectual more. My daughter teaches at a local university now, and she teaches in the business and economics faculty. But I don't hold that against her. But I'm one of these people. I taught strategy for a major university for almost 15 years, and I don't think the business is worthy of being an academic course of study, but that's just me. So they can do whatever they want, but every once in a while, as the Germans say, you know, a blind chicken will find a corn sometimes too. So I think we talk about pigs and acorns where I came from, where I grew up. So
I was going to say another cultural trait there, right?
Yeah, I know. See, and you're going, oh yeah, well, we have pigs, and you guys have chickens. Okay, whatever. Once they find it, it's probably not going to be long till they're on the plate. So it's all over. But one of the big discussions that's going on right now is there's about, I'm going to say 45,000, but I know that number is too small. But there's about 45,000 craftsman, tradesman businesses in Germany that are going to go away soon because there's nobody to take them over.
Shit.
Now, wow. One of the things that I found, and I still do because Germany's still fighting for it, but they're fighting a losing battle because the OECD is killing them on it. They keep saying not enough people are going to university, not enough people are getting degrees. And my question, and that was what I did in my project work, the international project work, the last place I worked, it was like, well, why do we want them to? Why can't people learn trades? And to learn a trade and the skill or a trade to become, let's say, occupationally qualified in Germany is somewhere between a 2 and a 3.5 year process. And it happens for the most part, about 50% of the training is school combined with the practical work. Like if you're going to become a plumbing or a heating specialist, or I'll take my son-in-law, he's a door and windows guy. Okay, so he's actually a door and windows builder. That's what he's on his piece of paper. And he worked at a little company down here in the village. It still exists. It still employs about 15 people. So we're talking about companies this size. And what's interesting as well in that regard, about 85 to 90% of all employees in Germany work for companies that have fewer than 50 employees. So the big corporations call all the shots and make all the moves, but that's not where people are working. So, you know, we've got that case with politics is just bypassing the reality of how things are, but everybody's recognizing the fact that we've got a problem. So if a person goes off to learn a trade and they learn a trade, it takes them, let's say 3 years to get it. It's half on the job, and it's very well mixed. They go to school a couple of hours in the morning and then they're on the job in the afternoon kind of thing. It's not an easy task for the 3 years. They get paid, they're employees. From the time they get hired, they get a monthly salary and everything. And at the end of the 3 years, if they do well, the companies generally offer them a permanent contract and hire them on as a journey person. Well, you can only run a subject matter related business. You can only run a cabinet maker's business if you are a master cabinet maker. If you've learned cabinet making and you're a journeyman, you can't run the business because you don't have the master. You have to go get a master piece of paper. And the total time between when you start learning and ending up with a master's degree takes about 10 years because you have to go through your 3 years apprenticeship. You have to work for about 4 years, and it's going to take you about another 3 years to do the top up that you need to get your master's letter. It's a big certificate. They're bigger and they're more impressive than anything you get from the local college because you got your BS and BS, you know. So, so.
This sounds very connected to medieval guilds, by the way.
Well, that's it. They live on. See, they live on. That whole mentality is still present in Germany, and there's an association of all of the guilds. It's called an Innung, actually, the German, where they have those, and so they still exist. They still have influence on the people who are working in those. And so what the professors have realized, because I just read an article yesterday in probably one of the worst examples of what you could call a newspaper that's published in Germany, about how the people coming out of school and going off to university can't read, write, and reckon like they used to be able to. And so a lot of the people that are at the universities, the professors are going, we've got kids coming in. I don't know what we're going to be teaching them because I don't know what they can get. They're terribly underqualified for what they're trying to do. So they've got this double dilemma. They got a lot of people studying that probably shouldn't be, who would be very well off and well placed learning a trade or a craft. And then if they wanted to, there are ways that used to be very difficult, but now there are ways open to kind of merge the two. If you get a master's letter, you can go down to the local authority and have that recognized as a bachelor's degree in that subject. So there are ways to like cross over, and the university is saying, okay, well, you probably don't need to go through the formal process. And they're trying to develop curriculums where people learn the trade, and then they come to university, and then they get this top off, and then they can find out, and they can start networking and finding out, okay, here's a cabinet maker's business. They've got, or a clockmaker. That's one of my favorite examples because I knew of one. It was a classic story. I can tell you some other time, but this clockmaker's business, there was 4 employers, the boss, the wife did the bookkeeping, and there were 3 employees. Okay. So and if his son, because the daughter may not, my wife's cousin was a butcher. When he retired, his daughter took over the business because she became the master or the mistress butcher. Okay, so now she runs the business. Okay, well, she runs a business on paper. I'm sure Dad still has things to say, but without that piece of paper, she can't do that. So they would have had to have sold the business if it's going to continue on. And if it's a good running business, that's what you'd want to do. What do you do? And I know of another guy who's running his own business up. He does it in. He's a machinist, and he does molds and models for people that are trying to prototype for production that they're making. And his son learned that and got into it. And he realized after about 2 years there, his son was the unhappiest person on the face of the earth. And he goes, why are you sitting around here? You got to do what you want to do in life. Yeah, well, in the business. And he goes, no, that's my problem, not your problem. So he was open-minded enough to say, go do what you want to do. He works in IT now, but he did find a person to buy his business. But that's what you have to do. So the universities are now starting to think about, especially in the business faculties, of course, where can we kind of glean the best from all of these worlds where we can enhance this recognition of the bodily, learning a trade. Well, I can't even begin to imagine how many planks of wood my son-in-law had to plane going through his apprenticeship, because sometimes he said that's what they did all day, and when you were done planing one down, so it was just scraps, they put another one in the vise, and you got to do it some more until you knew how to do it right. And basically what it was, until the wood told you how to do it. It's one of those things, you get into it far enough, you let them do it, because that's what happens eventually. And if you don't do that, you don't, but it's that bodily side that counts. Well, you can always add a head on top.
It's also just to add in, because I just ran across an article showing that working with your hands improves your brain.
Yeah. Yes.
Working with your hands improves your thinking. Yep. They're different, they're connected, but they're.
Going to the gym improves your thinking.
Yeah,
Working out is
but I like what Ed was saying, because this putting hands on reminds me, I had a cousin that was a motorcycle mechanic. He is one of the most smartest persons I ever knew, because he explained to me that you had to use your hands. Sometimes you had to put your hands in to find that place where the nut, or feel that edge, and that told him that feeling translated into thinking, oh, this is what I would have to do. And sometimes he used his imagination to find the tool to correct the problem.
let me back up a little bit. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, TJ.
No, I was just going to briefly mention one thing. Has everyone read Tim Ingold's Being Alive?
Yes, I have.
Only a couple of
Okay,
chapters.
yeah, because I was going to say that if you haven't, that's one I would recommend. It's just really good. And again, just tying in how you can't separate mind and body there. You know, when you're in a physical space, it all reinforces itself. And just real briefly, one of the good things that Merlin Donald was pointing out is that's the mimetic. And that's the ability to rehearse actions and to develop that whole kind of coordination between doing and, you know, remembering it and refining it and doing those actions. And he believes that precedes language, actually, that just actions in the body being able to do that would be necessary to put in place before we even develop language and speech and lexicon. But just that, you know, that refining and that's what separates.
I want to connect this back into the Axial Age and the second Axial Age, which some people are sponsoring in this book. And Bellah wasn't very interested in that. He was interested in the past and the past Axial Age and the background of that Axial Age, where it came from. And this book that we're studying is about the consequences of all of that. And so it's a subtle difference. And I think it's an important difference, because I'm interested in the next Axial Age. And I want to make that happen. And that's not a modest ambition. But I do think that's what our imaginations are for.
Right.
And I remember when it was a truism, it was a fact that a black man could never be president of the United States. I don't know how many of my black friends told me this when I was saying, we got to get Obama president. And they're saying, no, that will never happen. So it was a frustrating thing for me to be in between different imaginal worlds, and worlds that were dominated by a past dynamic and worlds that are being imagined, that we don't have any facts yet on the ground that can define that, but we have to pick and choose which elements of the past and which elements of this projected imagined future do I want to use to create these conditions, which I do not control, of course. And I think this is the kind of stuff that's important in reading this book for me. And as a personal anecdote, and now I'm using like a phenomenological first-person account here, and I'm drawing upon a theorist we've all been looking at, and he's in our bibliography, Kripal with the flip. And he was saying, he's a professor of religion, but he studies the paranormal, which is sort of a taboo topic in academia. But he was saying it's very useful. His guideline was you need to work with metaphor, hermeneutics, and phenomenology when you're looking at these kinds of experiences. And to add to that, I think something that Merlin Donald said in this essay that struck me as really interesting about vision, and how vision someone has to have a vision to mobilize the resources of the community. And then that vision gets old and tired, and a new vision is required. So there's always that idea of a vision, and it being something that has to do with aesthetics, the aesthetics of relationships. And I'm getting this from Sheldon Wolden, who's a political theorist who talks about, you know, in politics, they're always talking about this vision thing. So bringing all that together, I'm looking at when you're doing historiography at your best, TJ, How do you work with the facts? And Ed, you don't want to take on this task, I don't blame you, but as a hermeneuticist, and I'm casting you in this role, you may not accept it, but I often think of you as the guy who does the hermeneutics really well. How do you work with facts? And I can identify as an activist, a political activist. How do I deal, when I'm an activist at my best, how do I work with facts? And I wasn't planning on you being here, Michael. I'm delighted that you are, but I could pose a question for you as a body worker, a man in touch with his body. How do you work? And when you're at your best, how do you work with facts? I'm just posing this as a possible question, which may not generate anything for anybody but me, but I'm also looking at my own personal experience when I attempt to work with this. I was about 12 years old. I was just, hitting adolescence, all those hormones flowing in my body. I knew I was different. And I heard in the background, like my mother, my grandmother, and other family members, they knew I was different. And it wasn't different in a good way. It was different in a bad way. So I went to the library and I looked up homosexuality. And the news was not good. And I read Freud and I read all these social theorists, and there was a consensus that I was going to be doomed to a life of prostitution, alcoholism, and drug addiction. That was it. Or you're going to end up in an asylum. So it was criminal, it was insane, and it was pathologized. So I looked at all this, and I was at 12 years old saying, no, no, no. I knew I had to keep it a secret because at that point I thought, maybe I'm the only one who feels this way. But then I found out at the library, I read Oscar Wilde, I read Shakespeare, I read a lot of other Jean Genet and a lot of other free thinkers out there, James Baldwin, that there were a lot of people who had these feelings too. And I thought it was great when I found a community. I came to New York, came to Manhattan, I found a community, like-minded people. And we reorganized our society through not proven facts, but through our imaginations combined with selected facts. And I think some of it may have been factoidal, but it works, and that's where I think we're moving. This is highly speculative on my part, but aren't we sort of moving into something that could be a quantum history where there's a phase space, a possibility space, and then there's the actual space. And there's some sort of collapse that happens. But that the logic of possibilities is very different from the logic of the actual, where we have that, and I think we've talked about this a little bit, and I think what we might be second order, third order kind of logic, but there's, I don't know how I'm getting this from Stuart Kaufman. He's a great, I think he's working in the third order systems theory, but he was talking about this, the different logics, that the cat is alive and dead in potentia, but you open it, I'm talking about the Schrodinger experiment, but when you open up the box and you look inside, the cat is either alive or dead. So the logic of the actual is either or, but the logic of that phase space, of that potentia, is both and neither nor. And I think those different kinds of logics can create all kinds of frictions. Some of them are creative and some of them are extremely destructive, because you may want to have something and they say, oh, you can't have that, but that's what I want. This is but you can't have that. Here's the menu. This is what you can have. And I think we either have to adapt to that, or we'll say, fuck this menu, I'm tearing it up and I'm doing my own thing. There's a high risk in that, for sure. And there may be lots of penalties that come from throwing the menu away. But I think there's something to this that I haven't quite figured out, but maybe you guys can help me as we study this collection of writers, and what some of them might mean by a second not just a second order culture, but a second axial age. So that's my spiel. Thank you for listening to my rehearsal here.
Thank you for your question. How do I deal with facts from a historiographical standpoint is very interesting. So let's go back to the Axial Age. As you guys are, if you read the introductory chapters, is the Axial Age a fact? I mean, Jaspers threw it out there, and his point was that, all these contemporary people, there's some very big names in history, Confucius and Lao Tzu and the Buddha and Pythagoras, and, had there, I brought it up too, you guys, I don't know if you guys got the point of, had there been internet in 500 BC, these guys could have all gotten together and had a Zoom meeting. Of course, internet. There not being any internet, though, that struck Jaspers as there's something going on underlying it, across the field, at least in Eurasian civilizations and complex societies. There's something going on that's underlying everything, that's not restricted to one way of thinking, one cultural way of experiencing the world. But that's a subject of debate. There's all kinds of people who will point to you, well, you've got philosophy in Greece, but you've got monotheism in Israel, and you've got Buddhism and Confucius. And these are kind of different philosophical things coming out of different ways of seeing, coming out of different cultural understandings of things. So that's part of the debate. Was there really an axial age? Or are we talking about a phenomenon that can hit different civilizations, but they're not really as connected as Jaspers thought they were? Yada, yada. Jaspers was very keen on pointing out that this is a potential for seeing a unity in humankind. And he's writing after World War II. So any kind of philosophy at that point to bring people together is, definitely, something that was his concern. For me, thinking back to your question, John, what came up for me was you used the word reorganization and you used the word imagination. And I think when you're dealing with historical facts, you're dealing with ways of emphasizing things. And that means that what you emphasize at one time might not be what you emphasize at another time. Bringing Gebser into it, if you're dealing with history, is time, and history is kind of supposed to be a study of time and how things are moving through time, is that really allowed to erupt in your study of it? Can things change in significance? Can you move from place to place by different experiences and throwing different configurations into things and still come up with a cohesive next step, and knowing that next step is not going to be permanent, but that it's going to also evolve and change as time goes on? Can you throw different possibilities into the mix? So but again, it's, what is a fact is kind of going back to one of the basic things in the philosophy of history. So even before you get to how malleable the facts are, well, again, but that's the point. These things are not necessarily set in stone, they have to be interpreted. So you're kind of already if you're allowing yourself to think in those terms, you're kind of already in this philosophical phase space when you're dealing with historiography. And that's what I find, fascinating about it myself.
Right. And I think you're in that phase space too, as a political activist. Something that hasn't happened yet is not proof that things are working now.
Happen. Exactly.
And we're often told, well, what's the alternative to capitalism? I don't know, but that doesn't mean capitalism is working. And so I think we all have to do our best to conjure up alternatives. And it's going to be hobbled together and stitched together, no doubt with some factoids, based upon our previous history as symbol makers and as groups of people who got together and created operational chains. And I'm borrowing from Dave Loeffler, and that all comes out of our mimetic history, being able to point to something, look at that over there, and your partner says, oh yeah, I got it, And that's how we created the spear, the bow and arrow, and the trap. They were, they evolved in a direction. You have the spear came before the bow and arrow came before the trap, but the hunt, the outcome of which is the hunt, which is to get game, is expressed in the trap. All of those previous structures, from making the spear to creating the bow and arrow to create this, the trap comes out of that previous structurings, which came out of group attention. You had to have enough people without, they didn't have any computers, they didn't have any pencils and papers, they didn't have any charts to show each other. And so they had to do something else.
But they used their hands.
They did. That was all about hands and gesture and guesswork about what the other person was meant. And just one more anecdote. I read about an anthropologist who was, I think it was Papua New Guinea. He was studying a culture there, but he was in an area of the country, a rural area. He did not share a language with, there was a person, a stranger he met on the road. This person was deaf, a deaf mute. So it was a stranger. They shared no language. They shared no culture. All they had was, you know, gesture. But what amazed the anthropologist was he learned so much from this other person about what and he got a little narrative. The guy was visiting a relative of his who lived in another village who was dying of cancer, and he was there to take care of her. And that was his mission, you know. So he was able to get a lot of nuanced, he was able to get a lot of information and a lot of affective information, and without a language and without culture. So I'm just saying, I'm sure our ancestors, and even today, many of us, I live in New York City, we meet strangers all the time. And, you know, we probably met lots of strangers and we didn't have a language or a culture that we shared with them. But we found a way, or we wouldn't be here, you know. But I think we're living in this, we're moving from, and this I'm drawing directly from one of the talks I think Bellah gave about the explosion of the population, that from, in the Axial Age, the population was about 250 million. And I think it was, it hit 1 billion around 1800. And he said in 1927, it hit 1 billion. It hit 1 billion in 1927.
Yeah, within his lifetime.
Approximately now we're about 7 billion, and with an expectation of two more billion before many think we'll max out at 9 billion people. But it would be inevitable, it seems to me, that all these cultural clashes that we're having right now, if there is a direction towards them, or we're just flying by the seat of our pants, you know, so some sort of postmodern drift. And I'm tying this in with something that Alexander Wendt said about the direction he believes that we're moving towards. From, in the Axial Age, we had, along with 250 million people, we had about 60,000 political organizations. Almost all of them were tribal. And he says now, of course, we have about 190 nation states. So, and it was while he was taking a shower, he just said, I can't imagine 100 years from now, or 200 years from now, nation states will be the direction we've gone in. That he believes that the anarchic nation state as it exists today will not be the organization that people will be living in 100, 200 years from now. And that was an act of his imagination, but his field is international relations. It isn't quantum physics, but he's drawing upon quantum physics to, I think, hobble together this theory. Anyway, so I'm just putting that out there because I think what is the relationship between Bellah and Alexander Wendt and Kripal's The Flip? I think we have to use our imaginations to fill in some of the gaps, but I think they're there. It's just, I'm not very good at building arguments. I'm good at singing and dancing and reciting poetry, but I think there's a relationship here between these possibilities. So I'm just sharing that, and hopefully you guys can help me out with this, because I'm trying to figure this out.
You're muted.
I caught that. Thank you. you get this big thing that comes across the screen. It goes, you need to, you're talking and nobody's listening. Nobody can listen. I want to work backwards. Human beings are the only species on Earth that points.
Right.
So it's an innate ability that we have. Raymond Tallis wrote a beautiful book on pointing called Michelangelo's Finger.
I read that.
I highly recommend. Yeah,
we know John, you
nice.
And we have to put that on our bibliography. That's another good one.
Whatever. We actually, John, I have to tell, we have a pool started. We're putting down book titles, and we're gonna, whoever puts one down that you haven't read yet, gets to wins.
I'm really embarrassed now.
You're not. No, I'm glad.
Don't be.
I'm such a name dropper. I have to stop doing that. That's embarrassing.
No, I think it's important that you do drop the names so that we can make these connections. Otherwise, we would, I don't agree with Tallis on his fundamental approach to things, but I think he has brilliant insight into what's going on and offers very reasonable explanations for how he thinks things got the way they are. And for him, I was, he wrote a trilogy, and the first one just has to do with, how did we become, what makes a human kind of thing. And for him, he started off with opposable thumbs that led to the fact that we can even begin in nascent or other forms eventually evolve into what we now know as cogitation. Freeing up your hands and not having to walk around on them, do kinds of things, does wonders for this. And then next thing you know, whether you're trapping, shooting, whatever, and you get a little meat, and the next thing you know, brain capacity, there's all these things that flow in there. But he does take time to look at the detail. And the detail is sometimes important because it can lead to other things. So if you ask me as a hermeneuticist, I don't take it as an insult, okay? Because actually that's all I've ever done in my life, even before I knew that existed. Your model year, what, 54? Around there, John?
Yes.
Okay, so if you're 12 years old, that's 1966. In 1966, first semester, we have to write a senior thesis at the high school that I'm at. I wrote my senior thesis on homosexuality.
Wow.
Okay.
That's very advanced.
Well, the motivation is not noble, John. I had this little spinster English teacher who I thought I could get to go cataclysmic in some way, shape, or form, so that I proposed this title. And she thought that was the best thing she'd ever heard. It's fine. She said to me, finally someone wants to write about something that might make a difference. That was her reaction to this. So we go through that. So like you, at the same time, we're probably in different libraries looking at a lot of these things. And the only conclusion that I can write, I can't remember the paper as much as anything else, was this doesn't make sense to me. I don't see the meaning in what they're saying. That's how I'm now interpreting it after 51 years. Or 52 years, as it turned out. So there has to be, how do we know what makes sense? How do we know where meaning is? And that's kind of what's driven me ever since. I had the great fortune when I was here in Germany, and I went to German university because I didn't think I was going to get anywhere career-wise in Germany with just a bachelor's degree, because the German education system was completely different. The initial degree in Germany at that time when I was here was a master's. And so bachelors were kind of tolerated because England had them, and they accepted English bachelors, but they didn't like American bachelors because they weren't rigorous enough. And this is both by the English and by the Germans. That's why when you become a Rhodes Scholar after you graduate from Harvard, you're allowed to go to Cambridge and earn a bachelor's degree. You don't get an advanced degree. As they will call it, you get a real bachelor's. Okay. Now, having said all that, trying to understand things is what is what hermeneutics is all about. I like to call it, my short one phrase definition of it, it's the art and science of understanding. And it deals with text, sometimes the oral, most often they're written. But the key thing that I learned in my studies, and I became this way, as I had mentioned before, my supervising professor had studied with Gadamer and studied with Heidegger. And he was teaching Anglistic, applied, what we would call applied linguistics in English, okay? Teaching English is a foreign language kind of thing. And his specialty was teaching literature. So teaching foreign language literature, if you will. How do you understand a text? How do you, who's learned one language and is now learning another, how do you actually go about understanding what it is that you're reading? So all of this becomes very germane to what's going on, because you're running it through a whole number of filters, especially if you're, this might be your second or third language. And not everyone who learns multiple languages, because obviously back in the Axial Age, people were learning foreign languages, I'm going to say relatively quickly, because we don't hear a lot about people not being able to communicate with one another. I mean, it's real nice when we watch Cecil B. DeMille talk about the Exodus, and and the Hebrews and the Egyptians are all communicating very well, and all of a sudden,
in
later,
Chicago accents.
in Chicago accent on top of everything else, yes, and then later, they go into a foreign country. How do you get along with people? How do you manage? And so, I think since most of the people were illiterate, I don't take that as necessarily a negative term. They're not encumbered by all of that writing text-based stuff. My grandson understands everything I say to him in English, even if he doesn't answer in English. He understands, it's crystal clear. He understands everything down to the finest detail, but he's not speaking it, but he knows what I'm talking about, and he knows the difference between the languages. So they don't have that encumbrance of the text. Well, a hermeneuticist actually starts with the text, but the lesson that I learned, and it was probably the most important, it was the first lesson I learned, and it was the most important one, is you bring so much to the party that you're not going to get it. That was, if I put it in simple terms, you've got so much baggage you're bringing in here. I remember the first time my supervising professor was describing this to me. I just felt like, oh, geez, okay, because I'd never thought of it that way. We bring a whole lot to the text, and the text is doing that from the other side. It's bringing a whole lot in. And so what you do is you start sifting, sorting, looking for who's assuming what and how and why and where did that come from and what role is it playing, which means you're in this, they call it the hermeneutic circle. You're going in and out and in and out and around and around and around and around, trying to clarify that. So when I encounter a text, one of the reasons that I decided to try to learn biblical Hebrew, I read the book. No, I've read a number of translations of the book. And I've got a whole bunch of translations here in English, and I've got 3 or 4 common German translations. They still like Luther. Luther does a good job, but they've tried to contemporize him, and they've tried to update him so that everybody can understand it now. Because if you read Luther, it's kind of like reading Shakespeare in a sense. If you read Shakespeare as Shakespeare was, most people can't understand that anymore. So they're going through this other adaptation, revision process to get contemporaries to even understand this kind of thing. So you're reading that. And so I said, well, what does the text actually say? And when you start at that level with that, 2 things happen. Number one, you're overwhelmed by an enormous amount of grammar. And if you're not a grammar kind of, I'm a grammar geek. I admit it. I'm finicky about where commas go or whether they don't. And I have constant debates with my English son-in-law who thinks commas are superfluous, and that's why nobody understands the English, because they don't use enough commas, whatever that is. But you realize that this is a whole different world for a lot of reasons. And it starts with simple. I'll just give you one little thing. There is no absolute tenses in biblical Hebrew. They have no past, present, and future. They only have past and past, basically. One of them's used as future. One of them implies later. And that's it. Everything else that we do, all of this, well, I happen to be thinking at this very moment that whatever it is that I'm doing might be relevant for something that might have happened 2,000 years from now. They can express that kind of stuff, but it's in a whole different way. Because you're only talking about this happening before that or this happening after that. It's a relative tense system. And all modern, like even modern Hebrew implemented one. They have a past, present, and future. They don't have that, the distinction that we have in English with all of the ing form. You know, we have 6 tenses, basically, past, present, and future, present, a perfect of all of those. And we have an ing form, a continuous form alongside of that, which just drives English. People have to learn English insane. Okay, how do you know when to use that ing? Well, because you just know. Okay, right. Because they don't have, you can't say it that way in another language. So you realize you're reading a whole different story. And then, and there is an historical aspect. Well, when was it written? Nobody really knows. And where, we kind of know it was down there somewhere. We have this one text that, according to the Jews, you can't change in any way, shape, or form. You go to Nag Hammadi and they find all of these texts that were 1,000 years, written 1,000 years before the text that we have that's printed in our Bibles. And there are variations. They're small, but they're variations. So how did it get to be this way? And why is it these? And they're not as keen on spelling as we are today, you know, because they have different ways that they can spell the same word. So you can look at, and I've seen verses where they've spelled the same word 2 different ways in the same verse. And then you're going, okay, well, why wasn't that? Then you ask yourself, well, why wasn't that important? Now, there's a whole lot of levels and aspects to this, and I'm not saying that all of them are equally important, but they're all things that you have to take into consideration, I think, if you're trying to understand this text. So when I read the story of Jacob and the angel, as it's called, the angel doesn't show up until somewhere about, no, Hosea says angel. So Hosea is 500 years later from when the text was actually written, if not longer, because the text was dictated on Sinai to Moses, who wrote it down, kind of thing. It just says a man. That's all, just a generic word. He wrestled with a man. Okay, so, but what does that, why would he say that? Why didn't he say angel? You know, why, and the word for angel, I think I'd mentioned this in another conversation we had, just means messenger. Well, at that point, the person that he's wrestling with isn't even potentially, I would say, someone from whomever who's trying to communicate something to him. But later, everybody says, well, it must have been. So now you have that further context from within the, I'll use the word for lack of a better one, the culture itself, that is already influencing the text. So you have the text and what the text actually means and how it was written and what the culture thinks it means, and then what everybody else thinks it means because they're somewhere else. And what you end up with is this never-ending story of what does it actually mean in the end. And as frustrating as it is sometimes, that's the fascinating side of it. And I believe, huh?
Frustrating to the rational.
Yes, in a sense. Yeah. The rational hates all of that stuff, but it's even frustrating to the mental to a certain extent, because you keep saying, well, can't we order this? And then you realize, well, actually, mythologically, you can't. You know, so then you go back and kind of freshen that up. But I think the point that I'm trying to get at, if there's a point here at all, is you can take the text as it was in the past, but it's almost impossible to extrapolate from it. You're just left with whatever it is and whatever it means. But the point is, if you get some kind of meaningful meaning, that, because you're taking all of these things into consideration, you're looking at all of these aspects that are flowing into it, that might be helpful. Because obviously, I'm going to say obviously, maybe it's not so obvious. The text was written for some reason. Somebody or something wanted to communicate something. You know, if we take the Meru tack, as I pointed out, we come back to pointing the 27 letters of the Hebrew alphabets, the 27 directions of, you know, quantum and whatever that is. Okay, I can't follow, but it was all based on pointing. You're pointing here, there, whatnot. And, you know, we're the only people that can point, and that's where really the genesis of meaning is coming out of that pointing. So that I have no problem with that gestural approach to language. I think it's now slowly but surely becoming the generally accepted view that we weren't grunting for. So you can't extrapolate out of the past, but you can use what you've learned there to stimulate your own, saying, now in my situation with this set of context, which is kind of like this and kind of like that and kind of like that, how did they react? What did they do? How did they do that? They are human beings, and some of them, and I believe this as well, you can go back as far as you want, and there were always people who had already gone integral, and there's always people who were way mental before other people were even thinking about stopping the magic or whatever it was. You know, it's not monolithic. It's not just one thing, you know. And there might be something underlying it all, maybe. I like that you brought that up, TJ, because the first thing that flashed into my mind is I've been looking for this ever since I read it. But in Harvard University in Massachusetts, they were doing experiments with rats of a particular species of rats because they are particularly good at learning mazes or something like that. But they were giving them special tasks to do in order to figure out how do animals learn, and it's all part of that learning theory kind of thing. The rats got good at running the mazes. The next thing they heard or was mentioned is that the same rats of that, the rats of that species on Australia were performing mazes better than they were before. And this kind of threw off the people down in Australia. Where did they learn this? Well, maybe there is something underlying all of this that we haven't gotten down to yet. Maybe we need to be open to that possibility. This comes back to also what you were mentioning about the paranormal, John. This is why I like Kripal. You know, just don't go, well, it can't be, so it isn't. You know, maybe you have to sit down and take a real deep breath and take another look at it and say, okay, what could possibly be going on here? And those are the kinds of things that I think we can learn from engaging with people who are engaging with these kinds of things. You know, whether I agree with how they're engaging with, or I think they could do it a little better or worse, that's irrelevant at that point. But we can perhaps garner more for ourselves that we could use to put into play in whatever that we're doing, activist-wise, understanding-wise, history-wise, body-wise, you know, because that's what I hope. The only reason I do all of this is because I hope it's in some way I'll be, you know, a better person, whatever that is, as a result of it, or a more effective one, or a more informed one, or something, you know. I wouldn't be doing this if I thought it was a waste of time, so, which it obviously isn't, you know, I wouldn't put the energy into it. So that's when I'm at my best as the hermeneutist is John, I'm constantly wondering, I wonder if it means something else.
I love that. Thank you very much.
Right.
Is there anything different, Michael or TJ? You want to add something? I have a lot of ideas about that.
Yeah, so I'm going to throw my, no, not throw, I'm going to place my stuff on the table. But to do that, I have to give some context a little bit, and I want to make it brief. My body work began when I was 10 years old, and I had to go in because I had a hernia and I had a testicle that was rising. At 10 years old, and I'm being sent into the hospital for surgery to have somebody cut into my body. And I just frame it now from this perspective that that was probably when my hormones were trying to kick in. And so, you know, my parents did the best they could to help me with that. They didn't have a lot of understanding of how I might be going through something. Their only concern was to take care of my problem. I do remember going to the doctor that did this is going to really sound strange, was Dr. Wilbur. Okay. And I'm going, what? And he had all these in his office. He had all these testicles and whatever he operated on and rocks, clear rocks and stuff. And I'm 10 years old next to my parents. And I go into the surgery and I've made peace with this unconscious, deep buried image of when I went in to be operated on, whatever they gave me didn't work because I probably was so high anxiety, you know, it wasn't working fast enough. So I'm on the table. And fortunately, there was kind people around me, even Dr. Wilbur, and I think a nurse came in trying to help me just relax. And then giving me ether, which I still remember the smell of ether to this day. But it's like, here I am, and I was cut open, you know, and I think that began my journey of embracing all three of your type of ways of knowing, you know, and I have come to embrace all three of them to help me understand and work with, because another layer to this is I had a speech impediment. A lot of people didn't like the way I mispronounced words and Ed, this isn't a direction to you, but people that are fanatic about grammar, I could fucking smack when they go to correct my English or my words. In fact, I had one female friend, I had to say, you need to shut the fuck up. Stop correcting my speech. You know, it's just like, please, you know, I'm self-conscious enough and you have to rub it in. So I'm slow down, Mike. When it comes to text, this is one thing I'm really kind of vibing with Kearney and his way of text and flesh and how they go together. And they are different, but just using the word became flesh without trying to spout Christianity is the only fucking way. But just that phrase can be applied across cultures to me, that the word becomes flesh because it's our flesh that is experiencing the lived life, and us trying to find at some point moving from gestures to words and spoken language. But yet my experience is with people need to get back in touch with the fleshiness of spoken language. If they could get in touch with it and feel safe with it. And it is uncomfortable because we've been so ingrained to separate the two. This, TJ, the way you responded to, you know, sticks and stones, I've always had a problem with that fucking phrase. I'm going, they do hurt. They just hurt in a different way. And I've went through so much pain of people minimize or trying to tell me that my experience of being hurt by somebody else's words, to the point I had to outgrow of modeling that, of actually in turn doing the same thing, you know, of hurting people with my words. So that's what I bring to the table.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. That was very beautiful. And I resonate with that. TJ, were you gonna contribute something? Did you?
Just thank you, Michael. That was really
I was going to respond briefly because we've been quoting Kearney, and I think some of us have read some of him. And I don't know, do you know him, TJ? Do you know Kearney's book on anatheism? he may be someone we want to add
yeah.
to our
Yeah,
bibliography.
yeah, I'll put it.
But
I've got a growing list of, because unlike you, I've I've heard the titles, but I haven't put them into my mind yet. So
Yeah, let's not get overwhelmed. Let's not get overwhelmed.
yeah, we just had a conversation about him, and so he's sort of in the space here. And I just wanted to add something because we've sort of been going all over the place, but I think we've been looking at different disciplines and how what's going on between the different disciplines, going from historiography to phenomenology to hermeneutics, and how, yeah, and how the interplay of them.
Those connections are important.
Yeah, and how they create direction.
I think Ed said it on the thread too. It's like the silos that we've constructed around these separate,
That's right. And what I'm speculating here, but I think a third order culture, this is moving beyond second order, would look like what Nora Bateson calls, it's no longer disciplinary, interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary. She's talking about transcontextualism. So, and I like what she's saying because it sort of gives us a direction, not that we have to give up disciplinary or interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary, but as we move to this hypothetical integral age or second axial age or the quantum age or the emergent age, whatever this age you want to call it, and I call it different things from day to day, I think it's just useful to think about that. And what I remember when I was a kid and why religion was important to me then, it really saved my life. And why it's important to me now, even though I don't believe in God the Father or the Son or the Holy Ghost, that doesn't interest me at all. I'm all for retiring God the Father. I'm not interested in God the Mother, but I am very drawn to God as the stranger, God as the widow and the orphan. That moves me in a way that I think those previous identifications with God as a parent just do not. I'm also very drawn to God as the lover, God as a brother and sister. And these are the kind of, this I think is what Kearney's drawing from. Maybe just a different, and they've always been there, but it's just now we can give emphasis. And I also think that queer theory, which Kripal has contributed a great deal to in his study of the homoerotic in those Christian monastic traditions, how it was a suppressed homoerotic, but it was everywhere because he was a priest, but he was heterosexual, and he realized this homoerotic element was he was basically swimming in it. And he thought that the structure of the Christian setup would, if women were allowed to be priests, he says the whole thing would fall apart. It's held together by that suppressed homoerotic energy. Mm-hmm. And I find that very compelling. And I remember when they told me, homosexuals are doomed. And that was very much the consensus. It was certainly the church, the state, there was all widespread agreement that this is so. But I remember saying, I said, God would not do this to me. It was deep down in my body, and I just said, no, God loves me. God would not do this to me. And I remember Jesus became, to me, my first boyfriend. Jesus was the one I could count on. He loved me unconditionally, and he was always there for me. And I don't think this is just a gay boy's fantasy. Actually, I think it was very widespread. I think it's
John. Just I want to say that not Jesus was my friend.
Exactly.
And he has been my friend.
Right.
Your experience is your experience in relationship to him, and I honor it. But I have the common ground between us is Jesus has always been a friend of mine, as the song goes. But
yes. And I think we should. It's the glue. It was the glue for me that held together a very fragile coalition.
Yes. Oh yeah.
And I believe that's what. So that's when, as I mature and I let go of the childhood that I had, the traumatic childhood that I had. Some of it was very beautiful, and the traumatic adulthood that I had, you know, always in the background, there was Jesus. But I remember I didn't go to church. I still don't go to church. I don't see any purpose for that for me personally. But I do remember I've had, I remember in the 90s when postmodern drift was the norm, and, you know, everyone had deconstructed just about everything. And the fundamentalists who wanted to co-opt the Bible as their cultural prerogative.
Jerry Falwell. Jerry
Yeah.
Falwell.
Yeah, and I said to my friends who are in this postmodern, I said, why are we allowing them to take the Bible away from us? This belongs to me as much as it belongs to them. It's the foundational literature of the Western civilization. Why are we not fighting about this? And I look back on it now and I see that was I think a very, that second axial age impulse that sort of wanted to happen. And I think it is happening now. I think many people who have, you know, studied Buddhism and Hinduism and Taoism and different kinds of body work, or different kinds of yoga, Tai Chi, it's been just an explosion of different practices that goes along with all of these complex theories. And you know, I think we're now in maybe a new phase. And as we move out of this very destructive forms of atheism, which is equated to materialism in ways that I think are extremely distorted. And I think that's what I had this knee-jerk reaction. I'm not a believer for sure, but I do draw upon a sort of idiosyncratic sort of religious orientation. And certainly that sense of devotion that I felt when I was a kid is still very much there. And I feel like a lot of us feel that sense of devotion, a sense of beauty, an aesthetic drive that I can only call religious. Or is it, you know, maybe I'm spiritual. I'm spiritual without being religious, but not really. There's part of me that is quite religious. And I think that's a healthy part of me that I want to cultivate instead of just allow to, you know, just drift in this postmodern malaise, which I think we're reaping the benefits of that kind of drifting away from, you know, these, you know, getting caught up so much in deconstruction. As necessary as it has been and helpful in some ways, I think we're in this reconstructive phase. And I think that's really front and center in our attention as a group, as a community. I've listened to our conversations long enough and I've replayed some of our videos and I'm saying, oh yeah, I think that these are, we're looking for a deeper structure than the ones that the mental rational are.
So I have a question because I'm not, I haven't read it, but I don't know who can answer this, but as a metaphor, the Axial Age, can somebody break that out for me so that I get a sense of how that metaphor is being used or abused or whatever?
That's a good one for TJ.
Go ahead.
No, go for it. That's a good one.
Karl Jaspers' original theory, he came out in a book called The Origin and Goal of History. He wrote it in 1949. And again, This is the same generation. They've just all been through World War II. Gebser's doing the first volume of Ever-Present Origin at this time. Toynbee's in the middle of his study of history, which he's gone crisis to crisis, and how are we responding to it? So Jaspers wanted to look at something. He was looking at Hegel, who ties the entire axis of Western history, and the axis, meaning the central kind of pivot point around which everything either happens before or is influenced by. And in Western civilization, that's the life of Jesus.
Oh.
What Jaspers wanted to do was point out beyond Christianity an axis that would work for all of human history. Not just the Christian world. That's why he went back to, he centered it on 500 BC, but he kind of went 300 years before and 300 years after, kind of a 600-year period in which Confucius, Lao Tzu, the Buddha lived, Pythagoras, the Greek philosophers, Amos and Isaiah and Jeremiah, all the Hebrew prophets, probably Zarathustra or Zoroaster. They're not quite sure when he lived, but all these figures kind of showed up in this time. Now, a lot of the reason why we remember them is because they were preserved in text, basically, because we have theoretic mind is coming in according to Donald, the mental structure is coming in according to Gebser. But the writing has already existed, but now it's being used to preserve these ideas, religious ideas, philosophical ideas. And Jaspers' way of looking at it was, this is happening across the board, at least the major complex civilizations in Eurasia. So something's going on, something underlying in humanity is going on, like the rats in Australia responding to the rats in New England being tested. So something going on spiritually in the human race at this time, and it's the. Go ahead.
Did he use the word consciousness, or in that sense,
No.
or has people just taken his layout and then added the word consciousness, evolution?
Yeah, not so much. He wasn't thinking in the same terms that Gebser was thinking, and he wasn't really approaching it with consciousness. Something that Ed brought up in one of the preparatory thread that we had for this was he's already at the stage where he's examining the philosophy and the religions and the text, the context of things, whereas Gebser's going underneath that to look at consciousness, which makes this all. I loved Ed's phrase with that. That's what makes all of this possible, but not everybody's studying it. And Gebser doesn't figure in a lot of the literature, the history and sociological literature, that the civilization analysis that I've been reading at all. He's kind of,
but Gebser and Jasper and Tomley, they were all writing at this similar period of time from their own perspective. But there wasn't, and there wasn't necessarily they weren't connected and talking to each other about what was going on.
I'm not sure that they weren't talking to each other. I'm trying to remember. Well, Gebser's in Switzerland at this point. Is Jaspers still in Germany?
Yeah, but they were together on a radio broadcast. They knew each other. They interacted with each other, and they.
Right.
So
I'm not sure they agreed with all of each other's ideas, but they're.
No. Because good academics would. They had their. but they did know each other. They did.
Right. I
found it amazing. I don't remember where I read it, but they did. The Radio Zurich did like a 6-part series. Yeah, this is on public radio.
I'd love to get a hold of that.
It's still on the internet.
1949, where they're talking about Jasper's work, Gebser's working with Jung down in Basel. Anyhow, and they're discussing this on public radio. We have to imagine there are people out there listening. There's no TV. This is how some people are spending their Tuesday evenings.
And now you guys have Slaughter Day.
Okay, you can think of that with your own.
It's not tomato.
Yeah, this show's not running anymore. You have to, okay?
Food fight.
That was a great explanation, TJ. And you're talking about that radio broadcast with Gebser.
That'd be amazing.
And Jaspers. I hope someone's translated that. I would love to get a hold of it. I would love to hear it, just to hear their voices. And I'm really glad you're here, Michael.
Thank you.
I hope you'll read this book, because if you could get through Bateson, you can get through this.
Okay.
Because Bateson
I'll check it out at the library. I'll see if it's at the library.
Yeah, I bet you can find it.
The Axial Age, right? Axial Age.
The Axial Age and its consequences.
Oh, and its consequences. Okay.
Yeah. The spine will if it's at the library, the spine will crack when you open it.
Probably.
It's after 3. We've already.
Oh wow!
I'm amazed how fast this has gone.
Yeah.
And I feel like we've just scratched the surface. There's a whole lot more I can think of contributing here that I was trying to work out, but we could postpone that for our next meetup. But I just wanted to suggest, and we can go overtime too, it's okay, but I don't want to, if ever others have something to do, I would sort of like it to wrap it up as a group. But I just wanted to backtrack a little bit about the radio, tuning into a radio in a foreign country and sitting around and reducing the static. Remember that one, Ed? and getting the clarity. And I think you talked about Chaucer's tale, Michael, and sitting around the fire and telling stories.
Telling stories.
And you were talking about, TJ, that a path with light and shining light from different directions, coming in different directions, and being a servant of understanding. And I think, what did I talk about? Oh, I was talking about a prayer. This would be like a prayer, and I would be a servant of truth. Wow, I'm getting a different relationship to truth now. What that could possibly mean, because I've been truthy my whole life. Sort of like I've been swimming in factoids, and now I'm starting to take truth as something more serious than I had in my postmodern drift. So that's sort of what I've learned here today is, what do we know now about ourselves or about the axial age that we did not know before we started this conversation? If that's a helpful question, if something comes to you, that would be great, because I think this would be a good way of learning from each other what we have learned from this encounter today. Great, Michael.
Yeah, I'll go first. I'm glad I decided to come on and listen and also be engaged, because I shared pieces of my personal history and how to relate it to the larger history, and listening to all your slants on it. I just feel more transparent. I even have a little wiggle in my giggle, so thank you.
We're starting to entwingle.
Yeah.
Am I going to have to start making a vocabulary list so I can keep up with you guys?
Well, you come up with all those German words. We're going to get to.
Yeah, I know, but the words that I'm coming up, none of them are made up, unless I'm using Kipkerian terms, and then a lot of them are. But,
Okay.
But the thing that fascinates me about the German language is how it's actually how down to earth it basically is. It still has a lot of that. You just kind of glom words together to make the big ones. So a Tat, Sache is a done thing. And that's the basic. So even if you don't know a lot of German, if you know Tat is a deed, and you know that it's Sache is a thing or a subject or whatever, if you run into the word Tat Sache, then you can kind of glom them together, and you'll start getting some sense of what's going on. So there's a lot of places where it's very kind of defines itself. Now that TJ's gone through Gapser, for the second, third, fourth time, he really ought to try learning German and then reading him in German. Because I can assure you, that's a whole new experience. Because it is an excellent translation, but there are some places I can't read them anymore without having the German alongside, so that when I'm going through this, I can say, okay, well, what did he actually say? And go back and kind of look at that and get a better sense for what's going on. Not that it's a better sense, it's just a different sense, because it's enhanced in that way. And that's kind of how I see our little get together this evening. This was, okay, where are we and where are we going to go kind of thing. And we really got clarified. The book kind of sets the direction for where we want to go. But this evening, I actually feel like the radio got tuned. There's a whole lot less static in the air. You see, we're kind of kicking these things around and understanding that, John can sit there and go, I'm religious, I'm spiritual, I'm religious. I don't know, I'm something. Okay, and that is the point, because we don't really know how to address that right now. It's not just that. It's not just religion itself, which is a key factor. That's that word's going to come up a lot, because that's basically the starting point for where the book's coming from, and religion is real hard to get a hold of anymore. On the one hand, and when you start looking back, and this came out in one of the piece on Buddha, that that's not always exactly what we think it is. And it may be a little different. And maybe we have to revisit that. Maybe we need to think about that again, because unfortunately, we have that one word. And we use that word in a whole number of different ways. And again, Germans can add prefixes and suffixes to word to kind of throw them off. You know, I think it was mentioned in one of the articles, I think it was Whitrock. He said the word that Jaspers used to describe the axial age was Vergeistigung. Okay, now that German word, Geist means ghost, or it means mind, or it means spirit, or it means mental. And fair, if you put the prefix fair on that, it means to make it. Now add all of the above. Igung means is the ending, making it a noun. So is it a spiritualization, a religiosization? Is it a mentalization? Is it a, you know, what? And that's all he said. He didn't say what he meant. And that's the thing I love and hate about most German authors, is they don't tell you what they mean by that. They put the word out and go, well, you'll figure it out from whatever else I've said. Well, we'd have to read everything else that he said in order to come to terms with it. Jaspers does that in part. He does actually spend a good bit of time, at least in the 1961 edition that we read, because
etymologies.
Yeah, Jaspers hadn't been published at the time. You know, they kind of crossed paths on the publishing scene, but in the revision that Jaspers did later, he included a lot of footnotes about it. So there is something in there, more than one would expect actually for the actual date when this shows up. So it could be any one of those things, and that was that's what I heard John wrestling with. And you know, well, am I religious? Am I spiritual? What am I? If I had to say it, and we can say just about anything, but we don't know how whomever we're speaking to is going to take that, because those are all loaded words to a certain extent, and that's why being able to kick that all around again and again and again, hermeneutically sound, that we just keep kicking around until, you know, it just goes, okay, I think I mean this. And we can look at that and then kick that around for a while as well. It's not static anymore. We actually recognize what it is that we're doing. It's that we're chasing a bit of meaning, and so that we understand one another when we're saying things and trying to communicate. So I found that exceedingly helpful in this evening, and it was an excellent kickoff. The overview is where are we coming from as far as the book is concerned, and I think we've got some of that established, and of course that'll get concretized as we move along and move forward as well. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you, Ed. That was great.
Yeah, I impressed as always with the scholarship and the sensitivity that I'm looking at here with you guys. This is always fun getting together. And I think to piggyback on some of the things that Ed was saying, we're going to be kicking around this communication thing for a long time, because we're human beings and that's what we do. And it's tied to experience. And again, why I don't think culture can ever be any kind of monolithic thing is because your experiences are going to be subject to whatever is going on and subject to spatial and temporal changes. I understand that the Inuit have, I'm not sure what the number is, several different words for snow, as you would, because you live at the Arctic Circle and there's packed snow and there's loose snow, and you know, whereas it's just kind of comes around every 3 months, you know, for 3 months every year. For us, it's just a season, but that's where they live in. I think the ancient Hebrews, you have to correct me, Ed, bread is kind of the same thing. There's several different words for what we just lump it all as bread, but there's, you know, several different words for that. And that's the beauty of language. That's the frustrating thing about language. That's what stands in the way of making any kind of simplistic decisions about history or culture or whatever. But I think to keep exploring that is to keep holding open the possibility that things can be set for a time and then they can change. And I think going, you know, second axial age, this is a period of crisis like the first one was. Lots of little states going to war with each other, kind of figuring out what you're doing as your societies are getting more and more complex. And we're facing some of the same things today. And actually, probably not a second time, probably for the 10th time in history, just hasn't all been recorded. But I think this kind of experimentation, this kind of cross-fertilizing discussion is really great. I would love to see this kind of be happening more in our culture. Unfortunately, it doesn't. But if it starts here with us, then,
Right.
great. I'm having a blast.
That's very true, TJ, because I've said it before. In my small way, I take it to the street, and I actually use what I learned here by the way we've been communicating. And I'm going to bring, for me, the Buddhist notion of understanding impermanence or change is just really entwined with communication. I think that's part of, for me, when I work with communication and when I'm at my best, I'm not afraid of the changes that are happening. I'm not tightened up when there is tension between, like, me and on this conversation, just use, if there was, tension, there's tension, but it flows, you develop to use a metaphor, a seafaring way to communicate, and that, you probably crashed on the rocks a few times. So I'm jazzed about what's here, because I'll tell you, I'll leave here and I'm going to take you guys with me. You'll be in my head somewhere right here,
Back of your head, okay. I think I borrowing a phrase from TJ in our thread. He mentioned a self-enrichment program.
Yeah.
And that really resonates with me, because this isn't, to me, just your regular old study group, where you come together and although that's very valuable. I think to add this sort of self-enrichment dimension to it is a real attractor for me. So I just want to put that into the mix as well. And what happens next? I mean, we're going to figure this out as we go along. I know we'll work out the logistics. I know, TJ, if this is a good time for you, maybe next month we'll have read some more essays and we can make this a new morphogenetic field effect. It could be like a groove. We're laying down the grooves for the next civilization. I'm dedicated to the flourishing of the generations, of a future generation, which will not speak Chinese or English. And but it's that's the group that I'm resonating with. And I think that's a challenge, because of course I have to, deal with my perplexity and confusion with trying to make sense and make meaning in the world that I'm given, just as people always have had to do. But I think that visionary tendency in most of us, we want to cultivate that and create these forums, and they are small groups of dedicated people. I think are going to make this happen. I'm not seeing it on CNN. I'm not seeing it on Fox News. I'm not hearing anything in the Washington, out of the politics that we're doing now. But I'm encouraged, because it seems like there have always been throughout history small enclaves and salons and people getting together and swapping ideas like this that have then created the conditions for the politics to change and the ecology to get more refined. And so I think this is a win-win for me. And you guys have areas of expertise in areas that I don't, because I know what I know about history comes from Hollywood movies, basically.
Yeah, right on. Yeah, that's true.
I know a little bit about history from reading poetry and, listening to music. I pick up on history too, but I haven't done like an in-depth study of that. History books come and go in my life. I mean, I do know a lot about the Elizabethan age, and because I'm very drawn to Shakespeare. So I learned just about everything I could. And I did read some biographies on Elizabeth because she's such a charismatic character. But I've always been attracted to personalities in history, rather than, I think, what you're calling historiography, TJ.
Yeah.
But I think those are valuable differences to have, so that whatever area we feel confident in, we can draw upon that. And like those first person accounts, I think give us some depth that we would not otherwise have if we were just sorting out what the facts are. Because those first person phenomenological accounts, those are the kind of facts I think that history and politics pivots around. So anyway, I'm just sharing this as an offering to our group, and you've given me a great gift today. I'm looking forward to watching this video because I know there are a lot of things that I've missed. So it'll give me a chance to bring that to the next meeting, whenever that is. So if you guys want to think about that now, about what happens next, or do we want to work that out in the forum? How would you like to work
that out? Let's work that out in the forum, because that way ideas, we can throw them out. I can look forward to whatever days I can schedule and things like that. So.
Right. Well, this is a good time for me. If it's a good time for Ed and TJ, and if Michael, you're going to join us, you're more than welcome to join.
I'm going to join you on whatever day you guys show up. I'm going to make it a point.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
I'm very happy with this. Thank you all.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. This is great.
Thank you.
Okay. So.
All right, guys. Have a great day. Great weekend.
Bye. Take care, guys.
Happy
All right.
See y'all next time. I'll see you on the forum.
Yeah.
On the forum.